Not only do they use NOS in this movie, but they finally drink it too. Hey everybody, welcome to Mainly Movies. As part of my Fast and Furious franchise review series, today I'm going to be talking about the 2009 action racing sequel, Fast and Furious. If you're new here, please consider subscribing for a variety of movie-related content like reviews, rank lists, and trailer reactions. All of my reviews include a breakdown of the pros and cons, my rating, and some tailored film recommendations, so be sure to watch through to the end of this video for all of that extra content. Fast and Furious stars Paul Walker, Vin Diesel, and John Ortiz, and was directed by Justin Lin. Following a tragic event, former racing friends, Brian and Dom, played by Paul Walker and Vin Diesel, must work together to take down a cartel leader. Even though Tokyo Drift was the first Fast and Furious movie I ever saw, this fourth film was the first that I saw contemporaneously and with context. I didn't see it in theaters, but I did watch it shortly after it hit DVD, and partook in my first Fast and Furious marathon, watching the previous three immediately before. That certainly helped, but I'll be honest that I didn't really get it at the time. Binging the first few movies right before didn't give me much time to care about the characters, and I was definitely a little confused by this film's serious but almost comedically over-the-top tone. And so I was left kind of underwhelmed by my first run-through of the franchise. Luckily, it's grown on me over the last decade, as has this fourth film. Fast and Furious is almost a reboot to the franchise. It's not exactly a return to form, but rather a redirection back towards something more recognizable. The first film established the racing-centric story, but more importantly, it established a set of characters. The sequels prior to Fast and Furious really pulled away from both of those aspects. Too Fast, Too Furious only had one returning character, and made vague reference to some of the plot points from the first movie. Tokyo Drift did away with both the story connections and the character connections. So the fact that this fourth film not only acts as a story continuation, but also brings the established characters back, makes it the first traditional, true sequel in the series. And there's something exciting about that. Not that the previous two films were bad, but this movie feels more like the first film than the other two did. There are certainly some expansions when it comes to the story, but it all feels like Fast and Furious again. Like I said before, a big part of that has to do with the characters. It's easy to make fun of this franchise for its whole family thing, but at the same time, it's one of the more satisfying elements of the franchise. This family gets established in the first movie, and then we get to watch it grow and change over the next 2 decades. And this fourth film is the one where this family gets re-established for us. We get to see them back together, but the strength of their connections to one another is what drives this plot. It becomes a story about doing anything for family, which both calls back to the first film and sets up for the big overarching themes of the rest of the franchise. I mentioned before that this film feels the most like the first movie. It's got the characters, the criminal activity, the cars. There are a lot of callbacks. The Charger, repeated lines, Brian's undercover racing, which he does a quiet little fist pump to when he realizes he's going to be in the situation again. So it is the closest to that first movie, but it's not necessarily close. Fast and Furious is a return, a reboot, whatever you want to call it, but it's also a major turning point for the franchise. This movie is the beginning of the ascent to complete absurdity. Gone are the humble street racing roots of this franchise. Races are now exclusively part of bigger, globe-trotting schemes, and really everything gets taken up to the next level. This, of course, includes the action. We had a few fun sequences and stunts in the earlier films, but this is the movie where things start to ramp up. Today, the Fast and Furious franchise is known for its insane, over-the-top stunts and action set pieces. The characters are basically superheroes at this point, defying all laws of physics, but there was a time where it wasn't quite as ridiculously over the top. The action here in this fourth movie is definitely big. It's silly at times, insane at others, but it still has some semblance of believability to it, and is probably the last movie in the franchise that could make that claim. The tunnel sequences are pretty absurd, but they're still fun in a ridiculous way, in spite of the CGI. And I gotta say, the opening gas truck sequence is still one of my favorite and most memorable action sequences in the whole franchise. Aside from the action, we've got the story. As I alluded to before, this movie puts its family themes front and center, and so the core of the story actually has a lot of heart. But it kind of kicks off a little melodramatically, and then it gets a bit convoluted as pieces of the story just keep unraveling to reveal that there was more there than we thought. It works for the most part. It sets up a lot of what's to come in the franchise and is reasonably fun and interesting as you're watching, but I actually find it to be one of the more bland, forgettable stories in the franchise. Whenever it's mentioned, I immediately think of the tunnels and the gas truck, but then really have to sit and think to remember what actually happens plot-wise. Despite being a tad forgettable, there's no doubt that this film has a stronger story than its immediate predecessors. It's also a slightly more humorless story. I suppose the events of this movie are a little more solemn than the others have been, so a serious tone works for the darker, revenge-driven plot. And the film does have its moments of humor, especially between Brian and Dom, but it manages to be even less self-aware than the first film. Luckily, there's significant improvement here when it comes to character development, and Dom makes the jump to a full-fledged main character who we're able to see outside of the lens of Brian. Plus, we get to see Dom do wheelies in not one, but two cars this time. That in itself is worth the price of admission. Alright, let's talk about the pros and cons. Pro number one is definitely the action. It is greatly improved upon when compared to its predecessors, both in terms of the stunts and the races. The first few films in the series had an awful lot of cheesiness when it came to the car races. They had a very strange style to them, which wasn't helped by the iffy CGI. There are moments almost reminiscent of that here in the tunnel sequences, but they're not nearly as bad as some of what we've already seen. There are also quite a few more practical stunts than we've seen in the past, and even those augmented by CG are much more satisfying and fun than previously seen. The second pro has got to be the characters, or what I prefer to call getting the gang back together. Now, it takes a few more movies before everybody's back and involved, but this film saw the return of the main original characters. Brian, Dom, Letty, Mia. The family aspect was back, which helped to make the story stronger and more impactful. Plus, this movie starts to expand on the family. We get our introduction to Giselle here, and although he only makes a very brief appearance, Han gets officially tied into the main group too, while also establishing that this film takes place chronologically before Tokyo Drift. On the con side, the biggest issue for me is that this movie's a little bland. It's got a decent story, albeit a very convoluted one, but for some reason, it's always the least memorable movie of the bunch for me. I still like it, it just doesn't really stand out from the crowd of the rest of the franchise. Before I give you my rating and recommendations, I want to remind you that if you're interested in buying Fast and Furious or any of the other films I mentioned today, I do have affiliate links for all of them in the description below. I get a small commission from anything you buy using one of my links, so I'd really appreciate it if you use them if you're in the market for any of these movies. I'm gonna give Fast and Furious 3 out of 5 paws. It's pretty satisfying and fun as the first true sequel in the franchise. It's got the action, the heart, the team's back together again. It's just a little forgettable aside from the big action set pieces. I would recommend Fast and Furious to people who like the first Fast and Furious movie, or those who are interested in seeing how the franchise got to the ridiculous point it's at now. This fourth film certainly has a lot of callbacks and connections to the first, especially when compared with the second and third movies. So if you're looking for something that feels a bit more like classic Fast and Furious, this is it. And if you like the over-the-top craziness of the later films, this will be a good movie to watch because it's basically the beginning of the ramp up to absurdity. If you liked Fast and Furious, I would recommend The Fast and the Furious. Not only was it the movie that kicked this franchise off, but it's also the one that established the character relationships integral to this fourth film's plot. If you like the action ramp up here, you're gonna want to check out Fast 5. It's got one of the most absurd and fun sequences in the franchise, but it also continues the story set into motion here, and wraps even more previously introduced characters into the family. And if you want some non-Fast and Furious car absurdity, you might want to check out Death Race. It's over the top and pretty ridiculous, plus it's also set in a fairly bleak location. Alright, a couple questions for you guys. Number 1, have you seen Fast and Furious? If so, what'd you think of it? And number 2, what's your favorite movie that features tunnels? Be sure to leave your answers in the comments below so we can get a discussion going. Alright, so if you got some enjoyment, insight, or information out of this review, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button. And if you haven't done so already, please hit subscribe while you're at it to see more videos like this. Till next time, this has been Alyssa with Mainly Movies, the way life should be.